Well, good evening, folks. Here we are live on YouTube and again on Facebook for the second time we're doing it. We're live streaming to both of those platforms, and we are in a second of our Polish extravaganza this week, talking about what's happening in and around Warsaw in World War II. And joining me today, she was on last year in August, Alexandra Richie, a Canadian living in Poland, who's going to be talking about the middle period, I guess, of Warsaw's history in World War II. So good evening, Alexandra. How are you?
Very well. How are you doing?
I'm good. Once we always get started, I'm always happy. I'm always a bit nervous before, but we're here and we're going to talk about it. So for those who were with us last night, Douglas Nash gave us a really good presentation about the tank battles that took place in August 1944 around Warsaw that were much bigger than most people watching had ever anticipated, and we will touch on that a bit. But we're bringing you on. You, of course, have written about Warsaw, the uprising, but we're going to put it into a slightly larger context and look about where it sits in the campaign of the Red Armies to kind of push towards Berlin. So let's start, if you wouldn't mind, with kind of a recap of how the Warsaw Uprising kind of comes to an end, because I think people are aware of the kind of August the 1st commencing of it, but the end of it, I think, gets a little bit lost. So let's kind of explain a bit about that first for our viewers, please.
We just have to go back a little bit to the beginning when you know, how did it start? And the fact is that it starts on the 1st of August, as you mentioned, with the idea of the Home Army has of in a sense, welcoming the Soviets into Warsaw just before they take over the city and push the Germans out. This was the kind of the idea behind it. But the Poles thought that the uprising in that sense would last just a few days. They had very, very few weapons. They didn't have great supplies. They had very few soldiers compared to the Red Army. So they simply made the assumption that the Soviets would come in and effectively liberate them, and by mid-August they would sort of stand on a red carpet kind of thing, shake the hands of the Soviet generals coming through, and say, welcome to our city. We kind of helped liberate it, and that would be that. Well, of course, what happens is that the battles that Douglas Nash was talking about yesterday, was an absolutely fantastic study on the battles that take place outside of Warsaw just before the uprising begins, changes everything, because even if Stalin had wanted to go into Warsaw, even if he had planned and had decided he was going to go through with it, because of these extraordinary tank battles, because of Walter Modl's counteroffensive at the gates of Warsaw in the end of July 1944, Stalin just couldn't walk into Warsaw or encircle Warsaw as he planned, and then encircle the Germans and kill them all off. It was simply physically not possible, and so there was a delay as to when the Soviets could actually have gone into Warsaw. But by this time, the uprising has started. The civilians have taken over the streets and so on, and then it becomes, over the course of the weeks that follow, that the Germans have decided to go back and have totally crushed the city, but the Poles are carrying on the fight tenaciously, very bravely, with great courage, but it's inevitable that sooner or later they're going to lose. So we have the complication inside the city of this German called Erich von den Bach-Zaleski, who had been the head of the bandit, anti-partisan war in Belarusia. He starts to negotiate a settlement, which finally comes about on the 2nd of August. So there's really an arc in the uprising, from the sort of beginning, the Poles being sort of very jubilant, convinced the Soviets are going to come and effectively relieve the siege. And instead, what happens is the Germans fight back. They come back with the SS. They come back in full force. Hitler decides and exclaims that everybody in the city is going to be murdered, and the city will be flattened. And so from a very sort of ambitious, brave, and meant to be short-lived sort of uprising, it turns into this 63-day bloodbath, effectively.
And I was surprised in my prepping for this, when you search, as I was doing on Google, for Warsaw 44 events, everything comes up about the uprising, and then everything comes up about January 1945. And it was really difficult to find anything about that middle period, which is, after all, quite a few months. And so that's really what we're going to be focusing on today, what happened. And And, was Warsaw ever in the thinking of the Russians in terms of liberating it? Where does it sit in the grand scheme of having to engage the Germans? I particularly like what Douglas said about the Soviets interested in destroying the German army groups. They're not interested in liberating cities per se. They're interested in destroying their enemy that are ahead of them, and where they happen to be is important, not necessarily whether or not that happens to be a city that is waiting for liberation. And interesting, when I posted on Twitter about calling this show Liberation of Warsaw, people say it's not a liberation. I said, well, read the description on YouTube. Of course it's liberation, quote unquote. It ended another phase, and we'll discuss that later on. But let's talk about what the Red Army plan is. What after the Warsaw Uprising kind of fizzles out, and what is their aim there? Where are they turning their attention to? What do they want to particularly achieve?
Well, just again step back a little bit. You showed a picture of the map of Bagration, the great Soviet summer offensive of June 1944, exactly. And you can see in this that they begin with this massive attack in the summer, and Stalin believes that they may get to Minsk if they're lucky, kind of thing. And what happens is that instead of passing 100 kilometers in 2 months, they pass that in a few days. I mean, it's just incredible how quickly they move. They just sort of slice through the Army Group Center, and the reason that I'm mentioning this is because it's very important as to how the Soviets have learned how to fight since the disasters that they experienced in 1941 with Barbarossa, when there's chaos and mayhem, and they themselves are encircled in places like Minsk. The Soviets have learned a great deal in the intervening years. And one of the things that they do is they just go around these cities. So Bobruisk and Mogilev and Vitebsk are surrounded. It becomes what the Germans call a Kessel, or like a cauldron. And the Soviets just go past it, and then they send troops in to go and mop up, basically kill or capture the remaining Germans. One of the most famous examples of this is Minsk, which of course is a hugely important city for the Germans, sort of the most important sort of control center in Belarusia. And some 50,000 Germans are captured in Minsk and then paraded in Red Square on Stalin's sort of whim, because he wants to show the rest of the world, how extraordinarily successful Bagration has been. And so this is precisely what they plan to do with Warsaw. They do it in Białystok, they do it in Brest-Litovsk, they do it everywhere they go. Surround, get the bridgeheads. In this case, in Warsaw, get the bridgeheads in Magniuszew and then Puława, and then in the north around Modlin, and then encircle the city and then mop up inside. And so this was really their plan. They had not the actual capture of Warsaw was no more important than the capture of Białystok, or the capture of XYZ. And at the same time, in reverse, Hitler's making all the mistakes that the Soviets made in 1941. So he's declared every city from Mogilev to Minsk to Warsaw as a so-called fortress city to be defended to the last man. And so he's got these sort of troops stuck in these places, and basically waiting to be surrounded and killed off effectively, or imprisoned. So this is really the fate that would have awaited Warsaw had one of Hitler's most able generals, Walter Model, not staged this counteroffensive just outside of Warsaw in August 1944.
And we'll just bring that map up again that Douglas provided us yesterday. And I think two things I want to make now, make a point. One is we must move away from this cliche of the Soviet army just throwing lots of men at people and having no tactical nous and no strategic kind of cleverness. That is just not the case. When we look at the invasion of Manchuria in August 45, very well sophisticated mobile arms. This idea of them just throwing people at stuff is silly, at least at this part of the war.
And this map is very, very instructive, because it's hard to see perhaps on this, but there's the Model has called up the Hermann Goering Division, the 4th Panzerkorps, the Totenkopf and the Viking SS, 19th Panzer, and so on. So there's a formidable force that's slamming into the Soviets, and you can see it here coming at them from all sides. And Rokossovsky makes this gamble to send the 2nd Tank Army up to, you can see the black arrow that's going up to its Dniepor and Zegrze and this area. This is enormously important. Across the river from there, this is a confluence of three rivers, the Narew, the Bug, and the Vistula rivers. Enormously important. There's a huge fortress. It's one of the largest buildings in Europe to this day, started by the Swedes during the so-called Swedish deluge. It was Napoleon's big fortress and granary for his plan, for his invasion of Russia. And it's enormously important at this confluence of these rivers. And you can see this in a sense, the courageous thrust of the Soviets, trying to get up to Zegra. Had they succeeded, and had they managed to hold the lines, that the Germans would have been, the Army Group Center once again would have been in complete disarray. So this was absolutely crucial and extremely important moment in World War II history. And it just so happens that Model had been fortunate enough, pushy enough, lucky enough to get these troops in place and to attack just as he did. But certainly not the bumbling Soviets idiotically stumbling toward Warsaw. Absolutely not.
Yeah. But also, as we said again yesterday in the show with Douglas, is that this amazing advance by Water Model that was done in 2 or 3 days, it is their last big hurrah, though, isn't it? They after that, everything becomes a struggle for them. They can't replace their armor they've lost. They can't replace their experienced tank crews. So it was against the run of play, essentially, wasn't it? The Soviet army is this marauding, huge, great army. But as you said, I wanted to pick up on the fact, remind our viewers that bridges are key to this next sort of stage, particularly by January 45. These massive, great armies, you have to get across these huge physical barriers that we're talking about, the Vistula and the Oder and what have you. And so bridges will be coming in later on. So after the uprising sort of comes to an end there's that winter where it looks like not very much is happening, but what is really happening behind the scenes, kind of both at a kind of an operational level and also the higher ups? What are the senior commanders of both sides thinking about the next stage is going to be? Are the Germans thinking defense, where as you say, that Hitler makes the claim that they're going to defend the cities, but what's going on in terms of the kind of the grand plan at this point?
Well, there are a number of things that happen on the German side. Well, Model is shipped off to the Western Front, which is a great loss in a sense for the Germans, because he would have perhaps played things out differently. Then the Germans decide that they realize that the Soviets are not going to go into Warsaw. They understand this is not going to happen, and so, for example, Hermann Goering division is sent up to fight toward the Baltic Sea, up toward Allenstein and so on, and the Viking SS are sent down to fight in Budapest. So the Germans have made this calculation that nothing's going to happen around Warsaw. They know that the Soviets are planning this big attack in probably January. But they feel that they've got a little bit of reprieve. So at this point, as you say, that they're in such a disastrous situation that they're sending, divisions here and there and trying to sort of patch holes and foresee where the Soviets are going to go first and so on. Hitler's sort of very concerned with the Romanian oil fields. First of all, he's very, very worried about protecting supply of fuel and other raw materials from Romania and so on. And so he's very sort of focused on that. And so there, in a way, the front sort of diffuses and is a very, very strange atmosphere between the October capitulation of Warsaw and the January, the Soviet machine getting going again on the Vistula-Oder offensive. But it's very interesting what happens within Warsaw itself, because Hitler, who's deranged, and he has this visceral sort of total hatred of Warsaw. While men and material are so badly needed at the front, there's so much of a shortage of everything by this point, as far as the Germans are concerned. And what does he do? He sends special sappers, special groups back into Warsaw to effectively blow up the city, building by building, after having forced all of the inhabitants out to this Durchlager, Pruszków. The work, the number of people you need to do that, to administer 200,000 people being kicked out of a capital city, and then to loot the whole place. I mean, the place was just taken. Anything you could carry was sent to Germany, including works of art and libraries and everything else, but also, bedding and metal. I mean, just you name it, they took it. And then they send these people to go blow the streets up, one by one, so that basically about 80% of Warsaw on the western side of the river is destroyed and deliberately, purposefully destroyed. And it just shows in a way the sort of madness of Hitler, Himmler, and the rest of them, that on the one hand, these military considerations are so important to Hitler, and he considers himself to be the sort of grand strategic thinker, and yet he does something as insane as this.
Yeah, but by this point of the war, Hitler, insane decisions is kind of par for the course, isn't it? Really, I mean, everyone's having to work around in the German High Command the idiocy of Hitler. But interesting, we ought to touch on the fact that both sides have, we have this change of command. We've mentioned Model goes away, but the Russians, a new player comes in for the Soviets as well, and everyone will have heard of him. Let's bring up a photo. Where are we? There we are. So let's bring in Zhukov as well, because he's had a bit of a renaissance thanks to his portrayal by Jason Isaacs in Death of Stalin, which is that brilliantly giving him a Yorkshire accent. But he comes in. So how does he get involved in this area we're talking about, and why particularly do the Soviets make a change?
Well, a little bit like Hitler, you're dealing with Stalin, with a dictator who's absolute control over everything and everybody, especially in Stavka and who he's putting in charge. And there are some issues between Stalin and Rokossovsky have been very close. It's a very ironic and very strange friendship. He's the only one of his commanders he allows to whom he calls by his patronymic. Which implies a sort of intimacy and friendship. Rokossovsky was put into the Gulag during the Great Terror. He was in 1937. He was imprisoned. He had all his teeth knocked out, his ribs broken, and so on. And when he's actually planning Bagration, he insists on a certain kind of attack that Stalin disagrees with, and he goes out of the room 3 times for him to think it over, and then Stalin has him back in. And Stalin, at the end of this conversation, Rokossovsky recounts in his memoirs, says he sort of puts his hand on his shoulder and says, how was it in there? I.e., what was it like in the prison that I sent you to? And there's a sort of this very strange relationship, but something starts to break down during the Warsaw Uprising. One of the reasons and one of the sort of suppositions is that Rokossovsky's part Polish. His sister still lives in Warsaw. Is there during the uprising, and they're quite close. And Stalin has this belief that it would be not seen to be patriotic, not a good idea, if a sort of Polish foreign-y type person is the one who's going to get the prize to take Berlin, because by now Stalin knows that the Soviets are going to win the war. I mean, there's just simply no way that they can. It's more a question of when and how many of their soldiers are going to be killed in the meantime, but there's no question. And so he switches his allegiance particularly to Zhukov, to Konev and others as well. And he in November demotes Rokossovsky, who's done such a fantastic job in Bagration. He's really the general of the moment, the commander of the moment. But he moves him off to the Second Belarusian Front, which Rokossovsky sees very much as a demotion, and he actually blames Zhukov for quite a part of his life for having caused this, that he should have been the one to take Berlin, and here's Zhukov taking his glory, kind of thing. So Zhukov is now put in charge of the First Belarusian Front, and Rokossovsky is sent off to East Prussia. And of course, he plays a very, very important role finally in the defeat of Germany as well, because he, all the Courland Pocket and all the, defeat up and around the Baltic and driving toward Berlin from the north and so on. So he's very, very important, but he does not get the glory role. And so this is what's happening here from November onward, that Zhukov is and becomes this sort of huge star for all sorts of reasons. And as you mentioned, the Death of Stalin film, well, in a way, I mean, he gets, swatted across the nose by Stalin as well after the war, certainly. And he's demoted and sent off as a sort of regional governor somewhere and so on. But Stalin's jealous of his success. He's jealous of his fame. He doesn't go so far as to have him bumped off, which is a very, good
That's
thing.
the standard Stalin. Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that if you decide to become a pal of Stalin's, you're going to get double crossed and treated badly at some point, if not once, several times. You play
and
with the sword,
and,
you die by the sword.
Exactly, and the more important you are, the more of your own sort of power base you have, the more you're loved or adored by the people and by your men, for example. I mean, Rokossovsky was adored by his troops, unlike Zhukov. Zhukov was known as the butcher. He was seen to be very, very severe in command, whereas Rokossovsky was not. I mean, he had much more contact with his men and so on. But nevertheless, Zhukov takes over now, and so the plans for the great Vistula-Oder offensive go to him, of course, to Stavka and so on. But he's the one who's really in the driver's seat now.
And so, the Europe has come out of a particularly bad winter as well, which is another interesting thing that affects the Ardennes and the Hergenforest and what have you as well. So did that have any effect on when they were going to launch this, or was they preparing for that kind of weather anyway?
Well, no, they always, in this part of Europe, I'm talking to everybody from Poland. In fact, I live in the house which was the headquarters of the 4th SS Panzer division corps under Herbert Gilla. So I look outside and what do I see? Snow on the ground, and it's -11 tomorrow. So you always plan for this sort of weather in January, February in this part of the world, and even with global warming, etc., it's still here. And so of course they would have planned for it. The weather was so bad though in the earlier part of January that the offensive was delayed a little bit, but certainly not seriously. And by this time, over the whole front, the Soviets have over 6.5 million men. And in Zhukov's army group, facing Army Group Center, which has about 450,000 men, Zhukov has over 2 million men. So it's kind of a no-brainer that they're going to do quite well. It was rather the same sort of odds as when he gets to Zelo Heights and starts going on Berlin. I mean, by now the Soviet Red Army machine has just become this sort of crushing force. That's not to say that the Germans don't fight back and that they don't inflict enormous casualties. And as the Red Army looks as if it's going to get closer and closer to Germany, to the fatherland, the Germans fight even more ferociously because they want to save their country from these Bolshevik hordes and whatever else they call them. Yeah. So it's very, very violent and vicious. I mean, the last year of the war sees the highest casualties on the Eastern Front in real terms from any other period in the war. But nevertheless, Zhukov has now planned this extraordinary offensive. You've got the map up here, and you can see the area toward Warsaw, leaving Warsaw quickly. And the thing is that taking Warsaw is very, very quick. There's a bit of a fiddle because Warsaw was supposed to be held to the last man, as Hitler said. He's determined to keep the city because for him the Vistula River, and Warsaw is on the Vistula River, is a kind of a marker for preserving this fantasy, if you will, that Germany might somehow one day go back and win against the Soviet Union. And so for Hitler, the Vistula is a huge sort of symbolic river barrier, natural barrier. And but he happens to be journeying on his way back to Berlin when the Soviets attack. And there's a sort of fiddle saying, well, let's maybe not get in touch with Hitler and let's give the order to retreat. And this is done without Hitler knowing. So by the time Hitler learns that Warsaw is being attacked, he says, everybody has to stay there, hold it to the last man, whatever else. The news is broken to him that actually Warsaw has fallen and it's now in the hands of the Soviets. And of course, Hitler's absolutely furious. He goes into one of his, spittle flying, eyes rolling moments for 3 days. Just apparently General Warlamont, who's in Berlin with him at this point, writes in his memoirs how Hitler just cannot get over this for sort of 3 days. He's fuming and angry. And another thing that happens is that he starts to mistrust all of his generals even more than he did after the 20th of July 44 plot. So now he demands that any act of retreat, possible act of retreat, has to go through him first, which of course even further hinders his general's ability to
communications
act.
always comes down to communications. Yeah. So I mean, and for the purpose of understand those watching, a lot of people are familiar with Normandy and the Italian front and and what have you. So by this point of the war, when Zhukov is planning this massive, and you can see the distances on that map there. This is a long way to go. But what is a set-piece Russian attack by this point of the war? Have they got something perfected? Is each one different? Is it artillery? Is it air? Perhaps run through, if you wouldn't mind, what would be their sort of standard way of going about this?
Well, the first thing they do is they act on something called maskirovka, which is to hide what they're doing. So they don't want anybody to know. This was very, very evident in Bagration, for example, where everything was completely secret and nobody was allowed to talk about what they were doing. To some extent, this was true of the Vistula-Oder offensive, although less so because it was understood. The Germans knew that this was coming, and it was sort of, the secrecy was less important. Then huge, massive artillery barrages, absolutely massive, along with airstrikes. And then, of course, the tanks roll in, and then the artillery, and then the foot soldiers. But the thing that's characterizes it, I mean, look at this picture. You can see, I mean, every what is it, 7 or 8 meters, there's an artillery piece. I mean, it's just the sheer scale by now of what the Soviets are able to put in the field is just so overwhelming that the Germans simply don't stand a chance. Now, Zhukov does make mistakes. So very famously, for example, at Salo Heights, he's so desperate to go straight into Berlin that he attacks this very, very high kind of plain, and which is very, very well defended by the Germans. And then he does things like turn reflector lights onto the ground, but therefore silhouetting his own men, so they're shot by the Germans. And so some mistakes are made. But the point is that with the sort of steamroller of power of men and materiel that the Soviets can now bring to the field, even if mistakes like that are made, the outcome is inevitable. And as I said earlier, the Germans fight incredibly hard. It was vicious fighting. But in the end, a number of tanks, number of airplanes, number of men, number of artillery pieces.
It's overwhelming. I mean, I was reading a couple of days yesterday, I think, about Goebbels and the propaganda machine, and it was a sort of survey of the German public in this time of the war. And actually, they were sort of claiming that the morale of German civilians and the morale of German soldiers was actually rising slightly because they were defending their homeland. They kind of managed to sort of convince them of you're fighting for your fatherland now, and actually, despite these overwhelming odds, possibly the caliber of the German soldiers was rising slightly because they had something to fight for, because they weren't the other side of the world defending somewhere else. They were defending their own homeland. So maybe a bit of overconfidence on the Soviet side as well, and a bit of boosted morale for the Germans. It gets things interesting. But also, we must stress again these rivers, these crossing of the rivers, because again, people watching this, we take it for granted that the British and Americans, we have our Bailey bridges and things like that, and engineers. The Russians have got to cross the Vistula and these other rivers. Have they been making any particular preparations for that? Is it something they've been thinking about? What was the standard way of approaching that kind of bridgehead across river campaign?
Well, by the Soviets, and they're incredibly well equipped. Their engineering, by this point, again, their engineering teams are extraordinary, and they have, they have all the equipment they need. They, by the way, also get exactly Bailey bridges and all sorts of other equipment from the United States. They're incredibly skilled. This is something that they know how to do. They understand the terrain. They understand the landscape. They understand how these waters work. And this is actually crossing the waters themselves is not a problem for the Soviets. I was just going to mention a couple of things that you touched on with the the uprising and the German morale. I mean, one of the strange effects of the Warsaw Uprising was the creation of the Volkssturm, because Goebbels and Himmler and others see how effective it is actually if you get the entire population of a city like Warsaw to fight, throw Molotov cocktails, even if you don't have weapons and equipment. If you get 200,000 people throwing Molotov cocktails and building barricades, it's very, very difficult to get tanks through, for example. It is a terrible conditions under which to fight. It's the sort of Stalingrad idea. It's the worst thing in the world is to fight in a city that's being held by people who don't want you to be there. And so Goebbels announces the creation of the Volkssturm in September 1944 as very much as a reaction to what they've seen happening with the success, if you will, of the civilians in Warsaw. And Goebbels' idea is, let's motivate the German people to do what the Poles did in Warsaw, because if every German fights like that, well, then we might have a chance. And so that was one sort of thing about the creation of the Volkssturm. The other thing about morale is I'm not sure that it's morale in the sort of rah-rah sort of morale, but you have situations like the taking and then retaking of Nemmersdorf, which is one of the first villages the Soviets actually go into that's on formerly German territory. And the Germans, the Soviets go in and they're about it's a very, very tiny village, about 28 bodies found that have been shot in the head, women raped and nailed to barn doors and this kind of thing. Of course, Goebbels goes up with a film crew and journalists and takes pictures of all of these atrocities and so on. And these stories about places like Nemmersdorf, and then it starts happening again, because Nemmersdorf was retaken by the Germans, they're able to go in and film and so on. And so there is this huge propaganda push by Goebbels about what's going to happen to you if you let your women and daughters, and mothers, be met by the Red Army's hordes and so on. And so that propaganda and the fact that the Soviets are moving toward German territory starts to really kick in, as does the fact that however the Germans tried to do the Nacht und Nebel and hide it, etc., enough of the young guys who've been on the front have written back and said, we saw the population of an entire village in Belarusia murdered in a pit somewhere. We saw the destruction of village after village and town after town, etc. So the Germans, you'd have to be pretty isolated to not have some sense of how your boys had behaved out there. So there is an understanding that the Soviets kind of have the right to their revenge in a sense, and people are terribly, terribly frightened. So I think I'd question morale. What
morale out of
morale? I think
morale out of it's a desperate morale. It's backs against the wall. We've got to do something to survive. Yeah. No,
it's
that's a good
all
point.
or nothing. I mean, this is the whole thing about Goebbels' total war speech in February 43. It's like, we brought it on ourselves. Here we are. It's total war, and everybody has to do their bit. Everybody has to get out there. Otherwise, we are doomed, and we're all going to die in a horrible, horrible way. So yeah. But you're right. I mean, it does motivate people, and the Germans, become more and more fanatical on the Eastern Front, less, of course, on the West. Of course, they're fanatical troops in the West too, but this is not the dominant feeling in the fighting in the West. Whereas on the Eastern Front, it's just no holds barred.
Yeah. So let's get we mentioned earlier, or rather you said earlier, that the actual final attack on Warsaw ended up not being particularly it wasn't on Warsaw, it was around Warsaw, wasn't as significant as other ones. But I think in terms of what we're doing to try and get across this idea of Warsaw, how did things, the Vistula-Oder offensive, how did it impact Warsaw itself?
Well, I mean, simply what happens is that the bridgeheads in Magniuszew, which is to the south, and then the bridgeheads around toward Modlin in the north are captured. There's a bitter fighting at Modlin Fortress. The rivers are crossed. The Narew in the north and the Vistula to the south of Warsaw. The Soviets start to encircle the city. As I said, there's a bit of a fiddle so that the Germans are actually, Hitler would like them to stay and be basically fight to the last man, as he puts it. Many of the Germans are able to escape and go to the west. They head west. And so basically there's very little fighting for the city itself. It's surrounded, the Soviets go in, and then you have these tremendously moving scenes. People like Vasily Grossman, who's the sort of great Soviet writer, propagandist as well, describe the scenes of Warsaw when they go, and it's just the rubble is still smoldering from all these buildings that have been blown up. The stench of death is everywhere. There's tens of thousands of bodies in the rubble. And then very, very slowly, people called the Robinsons, who are people who've hidden literally underground, sometimes for years, start crawling out of the rubble and realizing that they've been liberated by the Soviets in that sense, and are free finally. A great number of Jews who managed to hide. Many of them were killed when the Germans went street by street blowing up the city, because of course people had been hiding. They'd managed to get a cache of food. They'd managed to get a water source, and they were just going to hide and wait it out to the end of the war. The most famous of these people is probably Władysław Szpilman, who wrote the book The Pianist, his memoir, which was made into a film as well. And he describes that feeling of waiting in the ruins and the rubble and trying to evade these German teams of sappers who are trying to blow everything up. But there are many others. There's a few hundred of these people who survive, but otherwise there's simply nothing left. And this is a terrible, sort of depressing scene even amongst the Soviets. I mean, there are a number of testimonies and memoirs of Soviet both soldiers and then people who come in afterwards to describe the situation, like Grossman, who just described this place that was a capital city of Europe and is now just a total ruin.
Mm. And I wanted to pick up on, again, because I said when I started tweeting about this show and Instagram, what have you, I did get Polish historians and Poles questioning me for saying liberation. You live in Poland, you've taught in Poland, you understand, you've written your best-selling books about Warsaw. I don't mean later on when they realized, but at the time the Soviets marched down those streets, did your average survivor in Warsaw at that moment see it as a liberation?
Well, again, it depends who you're talking to. There were very, very few people in Warsaw at that point. So the AK had been taken off to POW camps. Most of the civilians had been taken through Pruszków. So the population was tiny. So yes, the Robinsons who were hiding underground, or someone like Władysław Szpilman, was liberated, because if the Germans had found him, he would be dead. And the Soviets come, and this is the same. Almost sort of likened to liberation from a camp, effectively. If the Soviets come to the gates of your camp and they open the gates, well, you're free. However, the liberation in the broader sense is much more complicated in Poland, because as I said, Warsaw was almost empty. That's the now the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, the building you've just shown. This part used to be a huge palace. That's all that's left of it. It's become the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier now in Warsaw. Again, this sort of sense of what has been lost, and the destruction and ruin, but mixed with terrible trepidation about what's going to happen under the Soviets. There were many people from Warsaw, but the rest of Poland very much feared that you're exchanging one dictatorship for another. They didn't have a great relationship with the Soviets. After all, the Soviets co-invaded Poland in 1939 along with Nazi Germany and treated their population with tremendous brutality as well. The Germans were on a sort of a racial mission to kill the intelligentsia, to massacre the Jews. But the Soviets were on a class mission, and if you were of the sort of officer class or whatever, you might end up being murdered at Katyn. So both sides treated Poland abysmally. So this was not the same as being liberated by the Americans or by the British or the Canadians or whatever. It was a very, very different feeling. And
sorry. I mean, I'm just going to say, we now, when we look at the history of the Eastern Front and particularly Poland now, with the benefit of all the hindsight and incredible works like yourself, So the Warsaw Uprising, I'm not going to say it gets too much attention, because that's unfair to what the brave home army who fought there. But I just do find it fascinating that this battle that Douglas talked about is little well known. That the understanding of how as I said, I was searching for the Oder and the Vistula Offensive. There's not that much comes up. If you put Warsaw Uprising in, Google just goes crazy with stuff. So I know you've written a book about it. So you've made money from the uprising, but why has the world become so focused on that and lost sight of this greater picture?
Well, this is a very interesting question. First of all, after the war, it was forbidden to talk about the uprising in Poland, unless you talked about this tiny Armia Ludowa, which was a communist group that did also fight a little bit. People who were in the AK were hunted down, imprisoned. The Stalin's terror between August 44 and August 45 was directed primarily against people who'd been in the AK, the Polish Home Army, very largely, and so and people like my father-in-law spent 7 years in Stalinist prison because why? Because he'd been in the underground, he'd been in the uprising. So it was a time of terrible repression under Stalin, and really the only people who cared about or kept the memory of the uprising alive were the emigre communities who in London and in New York or wherever wrote about what had happened. And it was really forgotten by history. I think the Poles often complain that not enough people know about it. Now, of course, all of that changed in the intervening years. After Stalin's death, it was possible to write about it a little bit more. And of course, after 1989, it became a much more of a subject for open discussion and debate and so on. I mean, now it's turned into kind of a symbolic moment in certainly Warsaw's history. On the 1st of August every year, the whole city shuts down for a minute at 5 o'clock in the evening to commemorate the moment that the uprising officially started. But I mean, I would say that in terms of the battles that Douglas was talking about, there are all sorts of reasons why those haven't really been talked about as well. I mean, the Poles didn't want to talk about them because Stalin used those battles as the excuse not to help Warsaw at all. And so that's a big problem, because if you talk to the Poles about the battles, they go, "Oh no, that's what Stalin said, and it's completely wrong." Whereas, of course, these battles were tremendously important, but Stalin could have helped Warsaw. So both are true. The Germans don't particularly want to talk about anything to do with the Warsaw Uprising because it was a hugely brutal suppression of a city, and it's something that's really not discussed much in German historiography, and that's the same with these battles. They're very little known, and the Soviets, well, I mean, they got a bloody nose, and then they spent really up until the offensive in January. There's an area that the Germans called the Wet Triangle, where the Viking SS and others fought. They kept this position, until January. I mean, the Soviets were losing, bleeding men in this area to absolutely no effect. This isn't really something that you're particularly proud to talk about, and so on. I mean, but this is not unique to the battles that Douglas has mentioned. I mean, the great historian David Glantz has uncovered all sorts of. I would say he's probably the foremost historian of the Soviet Nazi war, and he's uncovered all sorts of sort of hidden battles and Zhukov's failures and all sorts of other things. So I think that the problem with Soviet historiography has been that there was an official history of the battles, of the trajectory of World War II, the Great Patriotic War, and the things that were sort of inconvenient or didn't really go along with this narrative were just sort of penciled out. And everything to do with the uprising and to do with these battles, and they're both included, is really very little known in Soviet historiography, for example. So I think it depends on whose history you're looking at, and comparing, for example, so many battles on the Eastern Front are not known in the West. People maybe know Stalingrad, they maybe know Battle of Berlin, they maybe know Kursk, and perhaps battles outside of Moscow. And that's generally speaking, I mean, not the sort of well-read history buffs that you speak to, but the sort of average person who knows a bit about history, that's probably all they would know.
Well, it's that problem. I say it on a lot of shows. It's that general acceptance we all seem to have for one timeline with one set of events happening along it, and that's how it goes. So June 44 is Normandy, and August 44 is the Falaise Pocket and the uprising, and it seems that we can only cope with one thing on that timeline, and it's like I did a show the other day about the Manchuria, and August 545, of course, is Enola Gay and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that controls the narrative, and the things happening outside of that just get lost because we seem to skip from one event to one event along that single timeline. And the uprising is important. And, Jenny Grant was on last week talking about General Maciek and how the Poles in Normandy were motivated by what was going on in Warsaw. Everything does connect up. But I think we should bring it back now, because Douglas touched on it yesterday. I'd like to have your opinion now. You hinted at yourself is that if Stalin had wanted to, he could have liberated Warsaw. So let's go back to when the Poles planned the uprising. Would they have been better if they tried to liaise with the Soviets? Would the Soviets have actually wanted to liaise with them? Is there some missed opportunity we can look back on now and say that something would have gone better there, or was it always destined to not work?
Well, the question of liaising with the Soviets or not is actually a great controversial one in history, because Rokossowski, in his memoirs, and then there are various other sources as well, because memoirs of the generals are always slightly suspect, but says, absolutely, there was no attempt to liaise, there was no attempt to contact me or us, and these sort of criminals, AK uprising, it was terrible, and they should have gotten in touch with us. Bor Komorowski conversely says that, for example, the Soviets were sweeping through into what had been Poland before, sort of in Lvov and other cities, and the AK, Bor Komorowski, under the plan called Tempest, said that the AK should go and help the Red Army in these places and help to liberate these cities, which they did. And what happened was that they would do this, as if Lvov or Lublin or wherever else would be liberated, and the soldiers themselves would be very happy and sort of dance around and have lots to drink and everything else. And then the NKVD would arrive and arrest the AK soldiers, and they would be either shot or imprisoned or sent off to the Gulag. And so Bor Komorowski says, well, now we're coming up to the Warsaw. Should we actually liaise with the Soviets who are going to do this to us, or should we just keep this, in a sense, the uprising effectively a secret? We do this thing, and then it's going to be such a big deal. The whole world will be watching, and we finally will have, because nobody has ever heard of what happened in Lvov or what happened in Lublin or what happened in Vilnius. Nobody knows. So we have to do something really big in our capital city, and if we do this and it works out, we'll at least put forward the argument to the rest of the world that we don't want to be ruled by Berlin, but we don't want to be ruled by Moscow either. And this really was the thinking behind it. So Bor Komorowski writes to London on the 13th of August saying, we have tried to get in touch with Rokossowski, but we've had no answer. There was this very strange a person who claimed to be a representative of the Red Army, who comes into Warsaw at the beginning of August and goes to Bor Komorowski's headquarters and says, I will send messages to Rokossowski. I'll get in touch with him. And so they send messages via this guy, and nothing happens. Bor Komorowski in early September sends messages via the Home Army in London to Rokossowski. In other words, trying to get contact that way. So it's a very murky, actually. And of course, contact is established between Rokossowski and Bor Komorowski, but only on the 18th of September. And by this point, it's so late that there's not really much you can do about it. But so there was sort of great sort of consideration on both sides. There's a stony silence from Rokossowski. There's, no matter what attempts have been made or what attempts Bor Komorowski claims were made, there was a stony silence from the Soviet side. So it's a very, very difficult one to unpick, actually.
And interestingly, in my opinion, because you've been writing about this for quite some time now. Have your own opinions about the subject kind of changed over the years as new archives have become available? Are you still thinking about it now, what you thought all those years ago, or have you changed? Because I know, speaking of Normandy, my opinion about the Normandy campaign changes weekly. So
yeah, no, it changes all the time, precisely for this reason. But I think that, I mean, my overall feeling about it is a terrible, terrible tragedy. I think that Bor Komorowski was quite weak. I think he made a mistake. He had information from Irana Kosmiecki and others, who was his main intelligence officer, that these very strange troop movements were happening in Modlin and around Warsaw. You don't have something like the Hermann Göring or Viking SS or Totenkopf SS or 19th Panzer just refitted from Holland show up, a couple of kilometers away from your capital city all at once and not think that something might be going on. And again, I think another mistake that the Poles made was that they to this day, Warsavians will insist that the Soviets were going to come in and go across the main bridges in Warsaw and liberate the city that way. I mean, and it's as if none of them has ever looked at Bagration and what the Soviets did in the summer of 1944 to every other city that they captured successfully. So why on earth would Warsaw have been different? Well, it wouldn't have been. And so there are all sorts of misconceptions amongst the Poles themselves and others too about what the Soviet intentions would have been. But one thing that I always come back to, and that hasn't changed, is that no matter how maybe naive Bor Komorowski was, no matter what impact the battles outside that Douglas talks about that impacted the timing as to whether or not the Soviets could have gone into Warsaw, the sheer horror of the uprising exists and exists because Hitler and Himmler decided to send the SS back into the city and kill everybody. The order for Warsaw that's announced on the evening of the 1st of August 1944 states, all men, women, and children are to be killed, and the town is to be glattrasiert, that is, level to the ground. I mean, the order for Warsaw is more complicated than that, but that's a basic thing. So then Himmler cobbles together people who were absolutely risible creatures like Erich von den Bach-Zaleski and Oskar Derlewanger and Kaminsky. You can't imagine worse criminals even in the SS. They're not, like, to come back and effectively do what they've been doing in places like Belarusia, which is murder civilians, and they're very good at it by this point. And so this really is the problem, I think, because okay, maybe the city wouldn't have been taken, maybe it would have been taken, maybe the Soviets could have come, maybe not, whatever. But you don't necessarily, send your worst SS people in to massacre civilians. The Wola massacre, 30,000, give or take 30,000 innocent civilians just lined up and killed in the courtyards of their buildings and in factories, abandoned factories, and so on. There's no excuse for this. It doesn't matter, how you look at the strategy, the military side of it. This is really what makes it so horrific. It's the willful, ideologically driven, racially driven decision by Hitler and by Himmler that evening, when they hear that the Poles have done this terrible thing and risen up against the Germans. How could you? And then they go back with this ferocious vengeance. And Himmler quite clearly says to Hitler, it's not really the best timing, but it's let's take this opportunity to flatten the city, because one day the Germans will be going back, and it would be great if just Warsaw, he calls it this abscess in Poland, is just erased. And this was the mentality. And so when you look at it that way, so for me, had they not made the decision to do that, had the people been allowed to stay in their homes, yes, there might have been some damage here and there, whatever. But if the Germans had they left and the people of Warsaw had more or less eked out an existence until the Red Army came in, it would be a very different page in history. As it is, it's one of the many, but one of the most shameful episodes in German World War II history.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Douglas said last night about the fact that he didn't use the word shitheads, but they send the worst guys into Warsaw, which but they were also, from the other point of view, they weren't the best units to have been used against the tanks outside. That was better suited to the Totenkopf in the 19th. So in a sense, the very fact that Warsaw got the shitheads is because those shitheads weren't the best ones to be used against the Soviets. So it was doubly bad. The Warsaw got the worst people because they were the worst combat people, but therefore they were the worst shitheads to go in there and cause such terror.
You're absolutely right, and it's actually also, ironically, it's because of the success of Bagration that people like Erich von den Bach and Derlewanger are sitting around doing nothing, and Himmler goes, "I know just where you can go and help me out."
I've got some shitheads up my sleeve. I'll send them there. Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. When I always want to, in this kind of show, when we're talking about these campaigns outside, I always want to kind of make that point of saying, just because we're saying that there's a massive great tank battle that Douglas talked about that we don't know about, in no way am I, as a historian, saying anything about the unimportance of what happened in Warsaw and the human tragedy there. Of course, it's interesting. And the Lena's coming on Friday. Don't forget, folks, to talk about some of the stories of the deportations and the guys who went to concentration camps. And she said, I've got some horrific stories for you, Paul. And, her grandfather was there. And that will add another element. These three shows I see very much as kind of dovetailing in a slightly different point of view of the same subject. So it's interesting to talk about it. But when we are left with this point that the Warsaw Uprising, as you said, there was just this big tragedy. But where is there any being? You said about these people now investigating these minor battles. Do you think we'll see a day where we start looking at the other battles with more interest? I mean, there are these new historians coming through because I think it's important.
Oh, I think so. I mean, look at Douglas's book. I mean, and one of the things that I want to say is, as just following on from your last comments, is very, very important when you look at a place like the Eastern Front to understand the connections between the ideological war, the racial war, things like what happened to Warsaw, the Holocaust, the mass murder of civilians, and the military war. It's much more separated on the Western Front. Or in North Africa, which people even refer to as a gentlemanly war or whatever else. That does not happen in the East. The sorts of massacres and so on. I was talking to you about the effect of Nemmersdorf on civilians. Well, it has a tremendous effect on the German soldiers as well and the Soviets as well. I mean, you start having terrible recountings of hospitals of POWs or guys who are injured in beds, just being, having their tongues ripped out and stuff. I mean, it's just, people, Germans killing Russians with pickaxes and shovels or anything. I mean, the whole thing just descends into a swamp of violence, actually. And it just gets worse and worse. And all of these things are connected, and they're all both military and political. There are reasons for all of this. There are reasons Stalin didn't go into Warsaw. There are reasons Hitler came back and destroyed the city. But they're connected to the battles that are taking place. And so, we've learned a lot about this from these sort of investigations into Wehrmacht crimes, for example, all the Soviet POWs who were murdered, 3.2 million of them. This was a Wehrmacht crime, and there are many sort of similar things which happen on the Soviet side as well, etc. But I agree. I think that we're also getting huge amounts of material that didn't exist before. 1989, 1990 was a huge breakthrough. I lived in Moscow in the 1990s under the Yeltsin years when the archives actually opened up. I had the tremendous privilege of actually getting a lot of amazing material, which now it's sort of shut down again, but one hopes that it'll come back. And even Douglas was mentioning yesterday the amount of material that he was able to find from these masses of Soviet seized material that the Soviets took, which nobody's had the chance to look at. And one thing I would wish is that the Russians would open up their archives and these materials and just make them available to scholars all over the world to look at, because there's so much material there. And I don't think we're going to learn anything new, big, huge news flash at 11 type new, but the filling in of the unit histories and everything else, it would be wonderful to have that stuff. But it's coming, and it's coming out slowly, sort of trickling out. And I think that the more that material comes out, the more we learn, the more sort of information we have around these battles and events and so on. It's just extraordinary, and that would be my wish, is that we just put more and more and more information out there and start to build up the pictures of these other battles too. I mean, after all, the Eastern Front, when you're talking, as I said, the time of the Vistula-Oder offensive, you're talking 6.5 million Red Army soldiers. I mean, each single one of those men and women too, had a life, had a perspective, had an experience on the front, whatever it might have been. And it's so vast and it's so complicated. I think that's perhaps one of the reasons that we've just gone for this easy, Battle of Moscow, Battle of Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin, because otherwise it's almost so big, so massive that it's almost difficult to even understand the scale. How do you picture 6.5 million troops? It's just impossible. Yeah. And add to that all the criminal aspects of what was going on on the Eastern Front. And you sometimes, I as a person who spent my whole life studying this, sometimes you just have to go take a walk in the snow and clear your head because the scale of it here is so vast and enormous. And so but I just hope more and more comes out, more and more people tackle these subjects. And
I think dialogue from all sides. Well, I think we need to get the Russians sitting down with the Poles and the Germans and the British and everyone. So we all did shit stuff. We all, and let's kind of, how can we work forward? How can we examine it? How can we look at the context? What can we learn from it? And you can't brush aside the atrocities. You can't brush aside the tragedies, but there is a context, there's a broader context, understanding it and looking at it. I think we're kind of on a verge of a new era where we with the veterans finally, alas, passing away, of reanalyzing these events and not removing the emotion, but being able to. I always say with my tours that when my customers say, we're going to put our analytical hats on for a few seconds, then we're going to put our emotional hats on. And when you go to the cemeteries, you have your emotional hat on. But now we're looking at the tactical prowess of the armies. We're kind of be unemotional for a few seconds, a few minutes, and we'll go back to being emotional again. And because it's difficult to take on both at the same time. I think that's when you're talking about, people being bayoneted to death in sewers, things like that, it's hard to kind of look at any kind of context because the horror is so overwhelming. But there is a context, and you have to kind of.
But I think that and I think you're absolutely right that it has to become a sort of international effort because each one of these countries, each one of these nations, each one of these ethnic groups, whatever, has their own history that they have to bear. I mean, if you're Latvian, Latvians did things, whatever. I mean, wherever you look, it's a difficult history in this part of the world. It just is. But there are examples, like in Germany, for example, this is a nation that's really, really tried to look at for example, the role of the perpetrators in a museum like Topography of Terror. And yet you also see tendencies in some of the other countries of Central Eastern Europe and Russia toward the kind of re-glorification of the Great Patriotic War or whatever else, sort of putting more blinkers on. I had a number of friends, very close friends, who are scholars in Russia, who until quite some years ago we corresponded and so on, and now I very rarely hear from them, and if I hear from them, it's very, very carefully. Things are very carefully written and so on. One gets the feeling that there's almost a sort of a censorship again about what one's allowed to say. So I think in one sense we're moving forward. I think that you're right that there has to be a sort of sense that we can now look at this history without the emotion, and yet on the other hand, one sees at the same time the use of this history for creation of national identity or national myth or foundation myths or whatever you want to call it, that's moving away from that sort of thing. And I think us as historians, we have to fight against it. We just have to keep fighting against it.
You're talking to a Brit now who, of course, Brexit, and whether you're for or against, the whole World War II imagery that gets used by both sides is just getting on my nerves. This little England, Churchill thing, so narratives end up becoming their own kind of advertising campaign. So the uprising and things like that. I'm not saying they're being used, but they have this life beyond their own history to being something else.
I think they are being used. I think I would go so far as to say that some of these things are used, definitely, and I think one has to sort of guard against it. I think it's one has to also remember that in all of these theaters, and particularly the Eastern Front, the so many people died, so many people lost their lives, lost their loved ones, lost their homelands, and so on. But this is not rah fun stuff. This is a deadly serious business and a tremendous tragedy for that generation and for generations that followed, after all. So I think it's our duty in a way to actually remember that side of things rather than the flag waving stuff. But it's difficult, isn't it? Because on the other hand, if your country behaved bravely and well, and your young men died fighting for freedom and for the chance to live the way we live, well, one has to also respect and praise and remember that too.
Objectivity and balance, I think it comes down to. Anyway, I've thoroughly enjoyed tonight's chat, Alex. It's been really good. I'm just going to remind people what's coming up. So I'm going to show a quick promo for our So that'll be Alina coming and talking about what's happening in Warsaw. We're going back to that period of September, October through to sort of January again, but from the city's point of view. So anyway, I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you, Alex. So I hope you'll come on again and talk about something else at some point.
Pleasure.
People love you, and I love listening to you. And I'm so glad Sarah Kirk. Give a shout out to Sarah because put me in touch with you.
I will. I'm talking to her tomorrow.
Good. So in terms of those watching, we've got lots of stuff coming. I think I've got 8 evenings in a row I'm working soon, so I enjoy it. So we got the massacres of the in Poland in 1939. We've got RAF Week coming up later in the month. We've got Iwo Jima Week coming up, which I can't wait. Great Escape Week in March. There's so much stuff. I made another contact today. We're doing some live streaming from Monte Cassino, I hope, in March and probably May as well. So no rest for the wicked here. You're teaching, you're writing, we're all busy. So anyway, thank you again, Alex, for watching. Thanks for everybody. Thanks for joining in. Thanks for watching, everybody. And don't forget, click out all the descriptions below. Alex's books are in the description below. How to connect with us on Patreon, our Twitter feeds, Facebook. It's all in the description below. Don't forget to share what we're doing with other people. We're gradually building up a bigger audience on YouTube. It takes a long time, but we're starting to get there. The caliber of guests is improving and getting fantastic. So I thank everybody for sticking with us because we're getting somewhere. So again, thanks very much for watching. I'll see you all again very shortly on World War II TV. This is Paul and Alex saying good night. Enjoy your evening. Thank you.